Before we begin, a quick but important note. This episode is not meant to shame, discredit, or invalidate anyone who's received a mental health diagnosis or for those who identify as neurodivergent. Diagnoses like CPTSD, PTSD, bipolar disorder, BPD or borderline personality disorder, the spectrums of autism, anxiety, and depression. These diagnoses can be life-saving. They can provide language, access to care, and a sense of community. And for many, they're an essential part of healing. What you'll hear today is not an attack on labels, but a reflection on how, for some of us, those labels can become over-identifications, especially after trauma when we're still searching for a sense of self. This is a tender conversation about identity, not a judgment on yours. And as always, this podcast is not therapy or medical advice. If you're struggling or need support, please reach out to a mental health professional. Now let's get into today's episode. Hello, and welcome back to The Quiet Exit. I'm your host, LJ. You're a psychology researcher and the author of an upcoming book titled Seen and Unheard. Today's episode touches on something raw. It's about what happens when your diagnosis, the very thing that may have saved you once, starts becoming a disguise, a crutch, a cover. Now, this is not a call out. Far from that, but it is a call in. And I want to be up front when I say this. This is not an episode about judgment. It's a reflection, a gentle one. Because sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we avoid when we're still trying to survive. So let's start with this. Diagnoses can be life-saving. For many of us, especially trauma survivors, hearing those words, you have complex PTSD, or this isn't your fault, it's your nervous system. Those words can feel like someone finally turned the light on in a dark room we've been trapped in for years. It gives language to the pain. It gives shape to the chaos. It lets us breathe again. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, accurate diagnosis significantly improve treatment outcomes, and they reduce long-term emotional and physical health risks. Neuroimaging studies found that PTSD, depression, and anxiety produced observable changes in the brain. So no, it's not imagined, it's not dramatic, and you're not too sensitive. And yes, naming it can bring relief. But what happens when the name becomes the only thing you know yourself by? When you've spent your life trying to survive emotional abuse, neglect, manipulation, maybe internal confusion. A diagnosis can feel like truth, like something solid to hold on to. You start saying things like, I'm anxious, I'm avoidant, I'm borderline personality disorder, or I'm just too much. And suddenly those aren't symptoms anymore. They're your personality. But here's the thing. There's a difference between a diagnosis and an identity. One helps you understand what's happening. The other tells you who you are. And if you've never been allowed to safely explore your own identity because you were always adapting to survive, it's easy, very easy, to confuse the two. Identity theory tells us that when your self-concept is fragmented, you naturally cling to the roles or the labels that bring you the most clarity or control. Especially after toxic abuse such as narcissistic abuse or any of the dark triads. When you've spent years being told who and what you are. The problem is when that clarity becomes confinement and the label stops being a mirror and starts being a mask. So let's be clear with something. Clinging to the diagnosis often isn't about drama, right? It's about survival. That's all you know. Because when you've been erased, dismissed, gaslit over and over and over, being able to say, I'm not crazy, this is CPTSD, it feels so powerful. It gives you a foundation to stand on. That's your soft landing. Judith Herman, she's one of the most respected trauma theorists in the field in the US. And she described how prolonged abuse shatters identity. You stop knowing who you are, so you latch on to anything that gives you a sense of consistency. And for many of us, that ends up being the diagnosis. But that's the paradox, right? What saved you once might be the very thing that keeps you from growing. In 2021, meta-analysis in the social science and medicine found that over-identifying with a mental health label increases the risk of internalized stigma, also isolation, and learned helplessness, even among people active in therapy. Why? Why would that happen? Because the more we believe the label is all we are, the harder it becomes to believe in the possibility of change. So, language matters. It's not just semantics, it's neurology. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, She's a neuroscientist and an expert in emotional therapy. And she's shown that words we use to describe ourselves actively shape how our brains organize experience. So if you say, I am broken, I am unstable, I am unloving, your brain wires itself to expect that. But if you say, I am learning to regulate, or I'm healing, or I'm human, you're building new pathways. That's how phenomenal the human brain is. That fact is why first-person language is so powerful. If you're spiritual, you would say the individual is casting spells on themselves. So, reframing is absolutely important. Not, I am depression. I am BPD. But I'm a person who is working through something extremely hard. And that's okay. Because you're not the diagnosis. You're the person it happened to. And you're also the person who is growing beyond it. Now, I want to talk about something tender. It's the elephant in the room. But it's real. We're living in a time where mental health is finally being talked about openly. And that's an extraordinary thing. That's a really good thing, right? But it also led to a culture where mental illness is sometimes used as a personality, a meme, or a justification. We've all seen it, the TikToks that say, that's just my BPD talking, LOL. Dating profiles that joke, I'm toxic but self-aware. Instagram captions that read, I ghosted people because I have CPTSD, deal with it. Listen, humor is valid, okay? Sometimes you need to laugh so you don't cry. I get it. But the diagnosis is not a license to bypass growth. That's what's key. You can have CPTSD and still learn to communicate respectfully. You can have anxiety and still be responsible for your triggers. You can be healing and still be held accountable. Others are not required to decode your symptoms. And they're not wrong for setting their own boundaries, even if your reaction is rooted in trauma. Research in 2010 by Livingston and Boyd confirms that the more we over-identify with our diagnosis, the more likely we are to withdraw, project, and resist relational repair. But diagnosis is not destiny. It's not a personality. It's not a permission slip to mistreat others. Your mental health deserves compassion, yes. But compassion includes responsibility. Not punishment, not perfection, but honest effort. Because growth doesn't mean getting it right every time. It means owning it when you don't. here's the invitation. Take your diagnosis seriously, but don't let it be the ceiling of who you can become. You are the narrator, not the label. You are the meaning maker, not the diagnosis. In narrative therapy, the first step is externalizing the issue. And I don't mean developing NPD or narcissistic traits and projecting it on others. I mean internally. You are not anxiety. You're someone who experiences it. You're not, quote unquote, too much. You're someone who learned to take up space after being told to disappear. Reclaiming your story doesn't mean denying the diagnosis. It means expanding it beyond it. If you've been hiding behind a label, please believe me, you're not alone. So many of us have. Because it felt safer than facing the unknown. But you are not your diagnosis. You're not your trauma. You're not your symptoms. You're still becoming. You're still becoming. You're still becoming. And the parts of you that were once hidden, they're still here. And they're ready to be seen. Until next time, take the quiet exit if you need to. You don't owe anyone the performance of staying.